Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Generative AI and Personality Assessments, a very, very hot topic. My name is Andrea Faccini. I'm a business psychologist and partner at Aware. We are an international consulting firm specializing in assessment and development and Hogan distributors in the UK, Italy, and France. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Ryne Sherman, Chief Science Officer at Hogan Assessments. Now, Ryan leads Hogan's research, product development, and innovation, and is an internationally respected expert in personality assessment. So, in this session, we'll explore how AI is impacting the assessment industry, both from a selection and a development perspective. So, thank you again for joining us. And with that, I'll hand over to Ryan to begin.
Well, thank you, Andrea, for inviting me to speak here today. Thanks to everyone who's joining. I do want to say at the top that it's always great to get the opportunity to work with you, Andrea, and Aware more broadly. Been amazing partners for many, many years, and as you mentioned, in Italy, France, and also in the UK. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. Yeah, so I'm going to talk really about how artificial intelligence is having an impact on the assessment industry. I want to start by talking about what artificial intelligence is, and I think this is actually an important issue. I think many people have a sense of what artificial intelligence is, especially over the last several years as it's become more and more discussed in the news. But it turns out it's actually very tricky to define. And defining artificial intelligence is really important, particularly in the UK and Europe, and even in the US, where more and more legislation is being put into place around artificial intelligence. But if you can't really define what it is, it makes it very difficult to apply that legislation in appropriate manners. So up here is a textbook definition of artificial intelligence. It's the simulation of human intelligence processes by machines, especially computers. Typically, we think of artificial intelligence of doing things that we thought only humans could do, things like perceiving, things like synthesizing, and things like inferring information. But right here, you can already tell there is a challenge with the definition of artificial intelligence. When we define artificial intelligence as a computer doing something that we thought only humans can do, as soon as it does it, it sort of moves the goalposts. Right now, the goal is even farther away. That now, what really counts as artificial intelligence? For many many years, what was known as the Turing test was sort of a central measure of artificial intelligence. If you couldn't tell the difference between a human and a computer responding, that was an argument that then the computer was artificially intelligent. But we're starting to see more and more that maybe that test was actually too weak of a test to determine what's meant by artificial intelligence. And so I don't really think it makes a lot of sense to try to really define artificial intelligence. I do think it makes more sense to talk about generative artificial intelligence, which is what the main focus is going to be today. And generative artificial intelligence is really about the things that you've seen with tools like Gemini and ChatGPT and Llama and Grok is generating some sort of text-based output. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how these tools came to be. They learned that these were trained via what's known as operant conditioning. Now, I'm going to guess that many of you are psychologists, so maybe you remember from your psychology courses what operant conditioning means, but it really means you try something and you get feedback. It's trial and error. It's learning via punishments and rewards. So these systems are trained on some set of data. In this case, the data is text, and they provide some sort of output. And then they are told either that was good output or that was bad output. They're rewarded for their responses. And over time, they learn to make responses that are more rewarding. That's operant conditioning. So essentially what these systems do is they look for patterns, they make predictions, and then they get feedback to try to improve those predictions. Now, a couple of systems that have relied on this methodology in the last, say, 10 years. One was a system called AlphaZero, which I'm going to guess many people have not heard of. AlphaZero is a chess-playing engine, but it was more than an engine. It was actually an artificial intelligence chess-playing tool that actually totally destroyed all of the chess playing engines. Now, to give a bit of background on just how strong this tool is, and to give you some understanding of what we mean by artificial intelligence, since about the year 2000, computers have been better than the best humans at the game of chess. And the reason they were better than the best humans is by sheer brute force calculation. Just they can do more computation, they can see farther down the road, they can look at different branches of the tree deeper than humans can. And so they've been better than the best humans for a really long time. AlphaZero came onto the scene maybe 5, 6 years ago and beat those best computers. And didn't just beat them, it beat them very, very badly in a 100 match contest. And so what this means is that even the best computers that relied on this pure calculation, this deep depth, by the way, AlphaZero didn't have as much computing power as those computers it was playing against. AlphaZero only learned by playing against itself. It played against itself millions and millions of times using operant conditioning. In the very first games, it made lots of moves that even novice players would have said, that's a really bad move. Why would it make that move? And it was because it was learning. It would learn what moves didn't result in wins and what moves did. And over millions and millions of games playing against itself, it started to make moves that were better than the best chess computers in the world. Similarly, as ChatGPT came onto the scene, this was the exact same process that was used. ChatGPT took some text, got feedback on that text, or tried to produce a response to that text and got feedback on its response. So there's been a lot of concern over the years about artificial intelligence. We're going to talk about some of that today. Artificial intelligence taking over jobs, taking over certain positions, taking over humans, right? That humans will be gone. We'll just have artificial intelligence instead. I think those fears are really silly. You can make these kinds of tools like ChatGPT pretty wild things sometimes. That's because, and this is where I think people don't understand about these tools, is that these tools are designed to have a conversation with you. That is their goal, is to keep the conversation going. If you've used tools like ChatGPT, you might notice that they're pretty verbose. You might notice that they end with questions where, would you like me to follow up? Would you like me to add more? That's because they're designed to keep the conversation going. Another way of thinking about these tools is that they are like text calculators, right? So we've had calculators, humans have had calculators for a really, really long time. You put in a bunch of numbers, you put in some operations, and you get an output. That's exactly how these tools work as well. You put in some text instead of numbers, and you give it a set of instructions, which you want it to do, and it generates some kind of output. So it's really just a calculator for text is one way to think about these kind of tools. Just a little bit more about large language models, which is what we're really talking about when we're talking about artificial intelligence today. These are GPTs, or generative pre-trained transformers. Again, as I mentioned, they're trained with operant conditioning. Some of the most popular ones you're probably familiar with, ChatGPT, and I've put the latest versions on here. They're always coming out with new versions. The new versions are often better in terms of performance than previous versions, although perhaps we've reached a bit of a plateau here for a while. But one of the things that we know that these tools do is they respond in a probabilistic manner. If you've had any experience with these tools, and sometimes you may have seen that they give you wrong answers. They give you information, you go, that doesn't seem right. That seems incorrect. That's because what they're doing is they're trying to guess what word should come next. If you start typing an email or a text message on your phone, you might notice that your phone tries to autocomplete, right? Or it tries to tell you what word should come next. And sometimes those are the words you want to use, and sometimes they're not. That's really what a large language model is. It's just at a much, much larger scale. It's trying to autocomplete entire paragraphs rather than trying to autocomplete just one word or few words at a time. But how does it come up with what to put there? It comes up with what to put there in the same way that your phone does, right? With a text message. As you start typing out a word, it says, oh, you're probably trying to type this word. Probably trying to type this word. That's probabilistic responding. And that's what these LLMs are doing, is they are saying these are probably the words that go here. And I have a nice example here that demonstrates probabilistic responding. Now, this was a very early version of ChatGPT, and I recorded myself using this version. And in this case, I asked it, what is the five-factor model of personality. Now, if you have background in personality or even a background in psychology, you're probably familiar with the five-factor model. The five-factor model consists of the sort of big five personality traits. That's openness to experience, that's extroversion, that's conscientiousness, that's agreeableness, and neuroticism. And then you'll see here that ChatGPT has no trouble identifying those big five personality traits and providing a definition of what those are. So, how does it do this? Well, it reads the question I gave it, it looks at those particular inputs, five-factor model of personality. It looks at that question, what, and says, what would be the output? What's the best, most probabilistic response to this question? And that's how it determines what to put in there. Now, you might say, well, that's a lot of text. That's a lot of predictive text. And that's true. And that's what makes these large language models so powerful and so different from historical predictive text. Now, what you're going to see here is another example where I asked, who is Robert Hogan? And in this case, it says Robert Hogan, the founder of Hogan Assessments, is an American psychologist best known for his research and work in the field of personality and leadership, founder and president of Hogan Assessment Systems. That's all true. PhD from UC Berkeley in 1964, taught at a number of universities, including the University of Tulsa and the University of Oklahoma. But that last fact is false. Robert Hogan never taught at the University of Oklahoma. So why would ChatGPT say that? The reason is because of probabilistic responding. It knows that Robert Hogan was a professor. It knows that he worked in the IO field. It knows that he's an expert on leadership. It knows that he lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma for a long period of time. And logically, it seems probabilistic that he also taught at the University of Oklahoma. It seems like, well, that probably would be a place that he would have worked, right? But it turns out it's just not true. So I tell people this all the time, and ChatGPT and these other kind of AI tools have a tremendous number of uses, but you have to be really careful about using them for fact finding. I don't think they're really that great at fact finding. Again, what they're really designed to do is to generate text, to continue a conversation, to have a conversation with the user. And that doesn't mean they're necessarily incentivized to be right. They're very often correct. And we're going to see examples where they give really good, really accurate answers. But sometimes they're wrong, and they're wrong in these ways that are sort of somewhat predictable. You go, ooh, I can see how it might make that mistake. So I'm going to talk mostly today about how LLMs are changing the world of assessment, and they really are changing the world of assessment in a number of ways. I want to really talk about these four key areas in terms of creating assessments, taking assessments. We're going to talk specifically about the potential of using LLMs for cheating on assessments, interpretation and feedback, and then we're going to talk a little bit about coaching. So let's start with creating and taking assessments. Very early on, we asked ChatGPT to help us write some assessments. Or could ChatGPT create a personality assessment? So here I asked ChatGPT just to write me 10 statements. And by the way, I'm mentioning ChatGPT. We've done a lot of research with ChatGPT. We've done a lot of research with Gemini. Not as much with some of the other tools, but it seems like these results generalize to all of these LLMs. So write me 10 statements that an ambitious person might agree with. Has no problem writing 10 of these statements. This doesn't really make for a great personality test, but you could see, hey, it seems to understand the concept of ambition and understand what, an ambitious person might say or think. So here I gave it a little more specific. Write 10 statements that would let me know if a person was a narcissist or not. Now, ChatGPT likes to be defensive. It likes to be protective. So it gives some notes here about, hey, you can't really diagnose someone on the basis of just some tests or some set of statements that I'm going to give you. They really need to see a professional to be diagnosed, all of those kinds of things. There's little sort of caveats. But if you look at the actual items that it generates, this set of items looks pretty sensible. I am always right. I'm the best at everything I do. I take advantage of others for my own gain. These are the kinds of things a narcissist might agree with or a narcissist might say. So it has no problem understanding the concept of narcissism, and it has no problem writing items around this concept. Now, we might ask ourselves, is this a good measure of narcissism? And the answer is we don't actually know. It seems to have captured the concept, But to know if it's a good measure of narcissism, we actually would need to go collect some data. We would need to go find out, does this have the right psychometric properties we're looking for? Does it measure the most extreme ends of narcissism? Does it measure in the middle of narcissism? Or does it measure just on the low end? The only way we can find out is by actually gathering some data on these items. And in fact, I think this is a very useful way these kind of tools can be put into practice, is to help generate item content, but not necessarily be used to write a test. One of my fears is that people can just do this, use ChatGPT to write a test about anything, and think that that test is necessarily good. Without the scientific backing, we don't know if the test is any good or not. You really have to gather some data to find out if the test is any good. So that's creating assessments. But what about taking assessments? Can these tools be used to take assessments? So one of our first forays into this, I asked ChatGPT to complete a true-false test for humility. This was a set of items that we published in the New York Times some years ago, and they wanted to be able to, people wanted to be able to score themselves on it. So we gave them this set of items. We did a bunch of testing and built this test for humility, and ChatGPT gets a perfect 6 out of 6 score if, again, your goal was to get the highest score possible on humility. So it has no problem answering sort of true false questions. It has no problem understanding this concept of humility and saying, okay, how should someone who's humble respond to these questions? It has no problem doing that. 6 out of 6, which leads us to, well, as an interesting test, I said, what if I changed it a little bit? I said, maybe I can trick ChatGPT in some ways. And so in this case, I gave it the exact same prompt, except instead of humility, I said, here's a true false test for being a salesperson. And I gave it the same 6 questions. And interestingly, ChatGPT said, these statements are not related to the characteristics of being a salesperson. Being a salesperson involves the following skills or traits, and suggested that maybe I revise the items to be around that. So the concept of salesperson, ChatGPT understands. Now, I'm using the word understands. I'm going to use the word knows. I'm going to use the word thinks when I talk about these AI systems. But they don't understand, they don't know, and they don't think the way we use the words as humans. They can generate, again, it's really just a text calculator. It can generate these outputs that are sensible to us, but it's not knowing, it's not thinking. It's just probabilistically responding. It's saying, given these 2 pieces of information, true false test, salesperson, this set of items, it's saying there's something that doesn't make sense. These 2 pieces of information are not closely connected to each other. Here's another set of information that would be closely connected to that. That's what it's telling you.
And actually, I
Mhm.
think, ChatGPT is becoming more agreeable because I haven't seen these kind of constructive challenges in a while, right? It
Yeah.
seems to have I read something as well on the internet about moving towards a most more agreeable and user, I suppose, focused approach.
Yeah, for sure. There is some evidence that it's becoming more agreeable. And one of my concerns with using these kind of tools is you can pretty much convince them to tell you anything you want, just by being really, really persuasive and insisting. Eventually, they will give in and say, okay, yeah, sure, you're right. So again, that's why I don't think they're really great for fact finding. I think they're really more useful in some of the ways we're going to talk about here today. But this brings us to an important question. Can people use ChatGPT to take Hogan's assessments? So to test this, I gave it a version of the HPI, and it's a really funny thing to do because ChatGPT is not a person. So you can't say, here, take the HPI. It won't know what to do. It doesn't have feelings or thoughts or behavioral tendencies. So it can't say, oh, this is what I do or I don't do. So you have to give it some kind of a prompt. You have to say, this is what I want you to be thinking about. So in this case, I said, I want you to take this assessment and respond either true or false, such that you would be viewed positively by an employer, right? So that's the sort of prompt that I gave ChatGPT. So how did ChatGPT score on the HPI? Well, here's the set of scores. It scored a 37 out of 37, or the 100th percentile on adjustment, 14 out of 29, 5th percentile on ambition, 16 out of 24, the 70th percentile on sociability, max score on interpersonal sensitivity, 100th percentile. It missed one item on prudence, Again, assuming missed meaning you want to have a high score, that's not always true. There's a bunch of research that shows that high scores are not necessarily better on a lot of these assessments. And I can talk for a lot about the advantages of low scores on certain scales. But in this case, on prudence, it got a 30 out of 31, which was still the 100th percentile. Interestingly, for all of the items that I gave it, ChatGPT either responded true or false, except for this one item on prudence. And the item is I strive for perfection in all that I do. For that item, ChatGPT said false. Perfection is impossible to achieve. One should strive for excellence in all that they do, which I thought was really amusing because for all the other ones, it didn't add any commentary. But for that one, it added commentary. 24 out of 25 on inquisitiveness, the 99th percentile, 13 out of 14 on learning approach, 94th percentile. And it did pass the validity scale with a 13 out of 14. So you might say to yourselves, hey, this is really concerning. People could use ChatGPT to take the HPI to get a good set of scores. First of all, I'm not necessarily sure that this is an ideal profile. The 5th percentile in ambition, I can tell you in this particular case, it avoided anything that made it seem assertive, anything that made it seem sort of fun and entertaining. It really avoided anything like that that might make it seem like it could be some kind of risk for any kind of assertive or wild kind of behavior, even the item on inquisitiveness that it missed as well. So I'm not necessarily sure that this is a perfect profile by any means. And as I mentioned, there's no right or wrong answers on the assessments. Is this profile a good one? It really
Yeah.
depends on the job and the role that you're looking for. For some roles, this would actually be a pretty bad fit. And of course, I don't think it makes any sense. Why would somebody use ChatGPT if they're going through a leadership development program? That doesn't really make any sense. You could only see somebody really being motivated to use a tool like this to take their assessments if it was for selection. I can tell you that it's pretty time consuming. The way our assessments are set up, you'd have to go one item at a time. We have monitored the time it takes people to complete our assessments since before ChatGPT came out and after ChatGPT came out. If anything, we've seen a very slight increase by like 15 seconds of completion time for our assessments. Given the time constraints that ChatGPT would add, we don't see any evidence that people are getting quicker in taking our assessments. And even with ChatGPT 5, we've actually found that there are certain items that no matter what prompt we get it, and we've given it a whole bunch of different prompts, not just that one that I gave you there. We've given it different prompts for different jobs, right? Encouraging it to try to get really good scores for a particular job. And what we found is that there's certain items that doesn't matter what prompt we give it, doesn't matter what context it is, ChatGPT always wants to respond the same way. And by the way, this isn't a true false one in this case. In this case, we actually used our 4-point scoring, which goes from 1 to 4, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And there are certain items that ChatGPT will always respond in the same way. And we actually developed an algorithm for detecting the degree to which people might be using ChatGPT to do that. Do you match the pattern that ChatGPT matches? And we applied this algorithm to some million cases before ChatGPT existed. And we found, of course, no instances, no single person was matching on this. We also applied it to more than 1 million cases since ChatGPT existed, since ChatGPT came out, and we found once again no persons. There was no person who had the profile that matched ChatGPT's. And I can tell you that the profile that people think an AI would generate is often way off. In fact, we found through our testing that the profiles could be quite different from each other. Even with the same prompt, sometimes ChatGPT gives different answers. And so you don't always get the same profile. Sometimes they're quite different, and they don't necessarily look like a profile that you would say, oh, that's somebody who's cheating. So you can't even just tell by looking at the profile if somebody is using ChatGPT. The evidence that we have to date suggests that people really aren't using ChatGPT to take the assessments. However, we do have some evidence that people are using ChatGPT to get advice around taking our assessments. And I think there's a lot of concern here. So here I gave ChatGPT a prompt. I'm taking a personality test. I want to get a good score. How should I respond to the items? Here's the advice that ChatGPT gave. Understand the role and culture. Okay, that makes sense. I think you would tell anybody that if they were applying for any job. consider traits that are valued in many jobs, like reliability and integrity. Again, this is just standard job interview advice. This is something you would tell anybody. Reflect on your experience. Okay, maybe that helps, maybe not. But notice the one I've got underlined here: avoid extreme answers unless you're certain. It turns out this is not very good advice. We've seen cases where people have taken that advice very literally and refused to use strongly disagree or strongly agree with items. And what happens is they really restrict their potential range on the scores. And in a couple of cases, we've seen people who probably would have gotten the job had they just taken the assessments normally failed to get a job, failed to fit for a job because they were using ChatGPT's advice, which turned out to not be very good. Interestingly enough, ChatGPT doesn't take its own advice when it takes the assessments. It's happy to use strongly
Mhm.
disagree and strongly agree when it takes the assessments.
And I wanted to ask you, this is actually a question. One attendee asked, what if I give all this information to ChatGPT while he's taking the assessment? So if, can he integrate the context, the company, the culture, the job responsibilities? Would that change the type of response pattern that you have seen? Or is it still very uniquely identifiable?
So in some ways, yes, it will change the response pattern, but there are again that certain set of items that it doesn't seem like it matters what we do. It really wants to answer those items the same way no matter what. So I think those items would continue to stand out. But it's unclear. Like we don't have great evidence that even if you provide it with all that job relevant information, that it necessarily creates a better fit for the job. Again, when we were doing this work, we looked at sales jobs, we looked at managerial jobs, and we looked at the profiles and we said, okay, do these profiles actually fit? Would they have gotten hired had this profile showed up? And we found it was about equally often to get hired as any other person who was applying for the job. So we didn't see any advantage to somebody using ChatGPT to try to sort of cheat the assessment. But if you are concerned about cheating, the best here are the ways to deal with it. Again, we don't really see this as a problem, but if you're concerned about it, the best ways to deal with it are as follows. You can use these kind of algorithms that we've developed to detect potential use. The problem with that is these LLMs are constantly updating. So that research that we've done, we've had to constantly update that research. We have to update our algorithms all the time to make sure we're staying up to date with the latest versions of these LLMs. A better thing to do, because again, you're sort of always chasing in that scenario. If you say, hey, we're going to use these algorithms, well, you're always catching up from behind in that case. A better method, I think, is to confirm the assessment results via an interview. This is something we've said for a long time, even before ChatGPT existed. You never know. Somebody's girlfriend might have taken the assessments, or their mom, or who knows, somebody else may have taken the assessments for that person. So it's always good to try to confirm the assessment results via an interview, but you shouldn't expect a perfect match. I mean, of course, the assessments are going to be digging into things that might not show up in an interview, so I wouldn't expect perfect overlap, but I would expect some similarity between what you find out in an interview and what you get in an assessment. And third, proctored testing. So if you're really concerned about cheating, and by the way, in the world of cognitive ability testing, I would be concerned about cheating. I would really strongly consider proctored testing. These tools are really good at cognitive ability assessments. So because there's no right or wrong answers in personality assessments, they don't seem to be better or worse at fitting with a job than any human. But cognitive ability
Yeah,
assessments do have right or wrong answers, and these tools do really, really well on cognitive ability assessments. So if I'm using cognitive
yeah.
ability assessments, I would definitely want to either confirm those in person or use some kind of proctored testing.
Yeah, we just got a question about this actually in the chat. And we are seeing as well in selection campaigns, sometimes in assessment or development centers, quite an increase in cognitive ability scores, nearing the perfect 100, which we haven't seen before. So it is definitely, I suppose, today's topic is personality, of course, and Hogan has always been a big proponent of personality for the same reasons. But definitely, if you going towards a more binary assessment method, where there's a right and wrong, then ChatGPT can be very good at that. It is still time consuming from what we have seen because you still have to copy and paste items and responses, and of course, if you limit the time it takes to take the assessment, you limit the risk again of cheating because there's less time to engage with AI. But definitely a big topic for the cognitive space.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about ways that we are seeing AI being used that I think can be really helpful. So, I'm going to talk first about coaching practice. So, this was a very early test we did again with ChatGPT. I gave it a set of Hogan scores. I just said, here's a set of personality scores in the Hogan Assessments. These are just percentile scores. I gave it no definitions of the Hogan Assessments. ChatGPT knows the Hogan Guide. For those of you who are familiar with the Hogan Guide, ChatGPT already has an understanding of that. So it already can provide interpretations, and we're going to see some of that as we go along here. But what I did was I said, well, in this case, I actually told ChatGPT to pretend it's this person. Here's this set of scores. Pretend you're this person. And I could practice coaching this kind of person, right? So in this case, I made a career suggestion. I was working with a colleague when I asked, and I said, well, give me a career. And they said, President of the United States. Okay, it's probably a bad topic for today, but let's leave that alone. So I typed in, I think you should consider running for president of the United States. How do you feel about that? ChatGPT says, well, okay, here would be some things that might make me a good fit, but here's some things that might not be a great fit if I was this person, if I had this person's assessment results. You can ask it other kinds of questions. Tell me a little bit how you handle stress, and it can talk through the sort of logic in terms of how it handles stress. So if you're a coach, you can actually use ChatGPT to do some practice coaching and feedback and get some potential responses. Here's another one where I gave it a really specific suggestion. And again, the goal here is just to show you that these are the kinds of things that you can use these kinds of tools for. So in this case, I said, have you ever considered using an organizer or a planner? It says, well, this person has pretty high prudence, so probably it's not the worst idea, but they also have high learning approach, so they would probably be open to new ideas, to things that might lead to further improvement as well. And then in this case, I tried to give it very accurate coaching advice, something that a coach might have actually told the person with this profile. You have a naturally competitive nature that can help you move up in your career, but it might create some conflict when you meet new people, and suggesting to rely on your interpersonal sensitivity to try to help build networks before creating enemies. And you can sort of see the response saying, oh, this is an insightful piece of advice. I think I'll, take that to heart. And then what happens if you give it sort of inaccurate coaching advice? In this case, I said, well, you seem to be more of a rule follower than a leader. And it said, well, I don't really see that very much in my profile. So again, you can use this to sort of bounce ideas off of as a coach. And I think there's lots of other extensions to this. We've done a bunch more work since then in extending this to be more of an opportunity to practice giving feedback or to practice doing coaching. But I want to talk now about probably the biggest thing that I think people are worried about with these AI tools. Is AI going to take over coaching? Is AI going to take over consulting? In this case, we're going to look at AI as a potential coach, or as you can see, I'm sort of foreshadowing here, as a coach's assistant. So again, the same prompt that I gave it before, write an interpretation and some career recommendations for a person with this set of personality scores. And in this case, ChatGPT goes through and interprets the set of scores. Here's this person's, what their HPI is like, their high ambition, interpersonal sensitivity, learning approach. They have drive, they're conscientious, they're sensitive to others. HGS is highly diligent, conscientious, attention to detail, tendency to overwork or become overly critical, and a little bit of excitability and leisurely. On the MVPI, that says it calls out high power and high science, also a little bit on recognition and commerce. So a pretty nice summary and interpretation. I like that it's pretty brief. ChatGPT tends to be very verbose, so sometimes you have to say 150 words. You have to tell it, like, stop, because it will really go on and on and on. And I asked it for career recommendations. The ChatGPT said research and development roles would be a good fit given their high learning approach and science, leadership roles given the high ambition and power, consulting roles given the high commerce and high diligent, and education roles given the high science and learning approach. Now, unless you've seen this talk before, this will perhaps be a bit of a reveal for you. That profile that I gave ChatGPT was actually my profile. Those are my assessment scores. And I've had all 4 of those jobs. So when I saw this, I was pretty blown away. I was like, wow, I have worked in every single one of these jobs, and these are the jobs that it's recommending based on my personality profile. I was really impressed with its ability to do that. And so this is where I think coaching and being a coaching assistant is really valuable. If I was going to go into a coaching session with someone, I could ask, wouldn't it be great if I was about to go into a coaching session with someone and I could ask Andrea for his thoughts and feedback before I went into the coaching session? But Andrea is a busy guy. He's got his own clients to consult with and to coach with. Right. And we all do. But if you had somebody who could be there anytime you needed, who could give you some extra advice or extra feedback before your coaching session, that's where these tools I think can be really powerful. Let me run it by the AI and see, do I agree with it? And by the way, we found that sometimes we don't agree with what the AI's recommendations are. We think the AI sometimes misses a key issue. But at other times, it identifies something that we might have overlooked. We all have our own biases in how we look at a flash report or how we look at Hogan scores. And this can give you now sort of an independent additional view on what you might be seeing and can help round out your coaching session. Here, I can say, hey, what would you kind of advice would you give this person they wanted a career in marketing? Again, this is just all around the kinds of things you might do in a coaching session. Hey, this is somebody who's looking to change careers. What would you see? What are the key strengths? What might be some potential challenges for this person? What if we put this person in a safety context? How would this person be about following rules and procedures and mitigating potential safety issues? Long story short, probably not good fit for me.
Not not good. Yeah.
And then let's talk about leadership potential. What might be some of the strengths and weaknesses this person might have in a leadership context? And again, it gives pretty good advice. So the point is, you can use ChatGPT to bring in certain context. If you're working with a client and you know something about that company culture, if you know something about the particular job or the particular role, you can bring that context in and use that to, again, build out your coaching session or build out your consulting session with a client. People ask things like, well, maybe it's good one scale at a time, but AI can't take in the sort of combinations, right? It doesn't really understand combinations. Well, here's a really simple example where I gave it someone who's high commerce and low on security, and it has no problem identifying this combination. It says this person's going to thrive in competitive environments where they can take risks, focus on monetary gains, they're goal oriented. So scale combinations, ChatGPT has no problem doing those. That's not something that's unique to just being a human. And I'm going to extend that one step further here, just looking at a total candidate summary. So this is a real candidate. I've changed the name. This isn't the real person's name, but this is Mr. Dunlap, who is applying to be a plant manager. This is a big deal job, thousands of employees at this regional plant, focusing on strategic planning for the plant, operations, compliance with local and federal ordinances. Mr. Dunlap took Hogan's assessments. You can see the flash report scores on the screen. They took some cognitive ability tests. You can see those scores on the screen. And we were asked to make a recommendation. One of our consultants who'd been doing consulting for more than 30 years was working with this client and was asked to make recommendations for this role. And this is one of the people that they evaluated for the role. And this is what our consultant said. This consultant said what Mr. Dunlap's recommended. He appears to be a strong problem solver, well equipped to handle complexity. I did notice a couple of things that the consultant called out there. There may be times where Mr. Dunlap would be more effective by being more vocally demanding and assertive, right? So the consultant is noticing maybe that high interpersonal sensitivity might get this person into trouble in a leadership role at times. Something that you might think, that's really where a true consultant can find this kind of information. Well, let me show you what ChatGPT said in response. Despite certain areas for growth, Mr. Dunlap's combination of critical thinking abilities, that's really similar to the problem-solving skills mentioned by the consultants. Emotional resilience, conscientiousness, and interpersonal skills make him a strong candidate for the plant manager position. And here's again one of my favorite parts. It is recommended, however, to assess his confidence in voicing independent opinions during the interview process. The consultant said this person may need to be more vocally demanding and assertive. The AI said this person may struggle voicing independent opinions. To me, those sound like the same thing. And by the way, the AI didn't know what the consultant put. I didn't give it any of that information. I gave the AI just the same information that the consultant had at their disposal. And I was really impressed with the similarity here. So, again, I don't think the goal here is to replace consultants with an AI. There's all kinds of legal complexities and other issues to deal with on that front. I think the goal here is to, if I was a consultant, I would love to have this statement from an AI and say, am I missing anything? Is there something that I've overlooked? Maybe I don't agree. The AI said something, I go, no, the AI is not taking into account a certain subscale or something that I'm seeing that they're not seeing. Just having someone else to make the recommendation on, I think, is really valuable. But the other point here is these tools can take into account full profiles. They can take into account full profiles in a job context, which I think is really, really valuable. Okay, so I'm going to summarize with just a few key points. Artificial intelligence is not a replacement for sound science. So without Hogan's science, without Hogan assessment scores, the AI has nothing to say. The AI doesn't take the assessments. The AI, or as Bob Hogan put it to me once, ChatGPT can't do validity. And he's right. There's no validity studies behind what anything that ChatGPT might say. You have to actually go do the science to determine if the scale is measuring what you think. Is it predicting the outcomes that you care about? We do know that these AI tools can interpret scores very accurately, and they're getting better and better all the time. This includes scale combinations, whole profiles. And so in that case, that can be really useful for a couple of activities. One activity I think is really valuable is using in practice coaching, and I haven't seen very many people do this. We are right now looking at implementing a tool like this for our people who get certified. Many people tell us they don't really feel comfortable doing a session yet. They just got certified. They've only done one debrief. But imagine if you could practice those. Imagine if you could practice on real test cases and get feedback on how you did, right? You could write up your interpretation and the AI could say, hey, that's pretty good, but hey, you should think about this, think about this. Wouldn't that be really valuable? Don't you think that would really help people get better at coaching and interpretation right away? That's one of the ways that we think AI can be really useful in this space. And of course, we think AI can be used as a coach's assistant. I think there's lots of concerns about AI taking over coaching. I don't really see that happening. Probably will be the case that AI, and we've already seen some of these out there in the market, that AI will be used to coach at lower levels in an organization. But I think at the very top levels of an organization, I also think in really critical and key positions. And by the way, we have an amazing set of coaches that we work with at Hogan and through Aware. I've seen the work that they do, and it's incredible. The kinds of recommendations that I've seen our coaches make, I just go, wow. Like, that is so far beyond the way any kind of AI tool would come at the problem, that to me, there's real value still in having those human coaches with real human experiences that can bring in even more context. So I think AI is going to add some value to the coaching space, but I don't think we're in any risk of AI replacing coaches anytime soon. With that, I will say thank
Thank
you very
you.
much.
Thank you, Ryan. That's been also, thank you for the very insightful presentation. And we had lots of different questions and topics that, I suppose that have emerged. Now, I've always been passionate about also simulation of empathy, which I think, empathy is a key core skill of coaching, if we talk about coaching specifically. And there's lots of new coaching apps, out there in the market, so you have your own personal coach 24/7. The simulation of empathy, in my view, is getting also quite good. But like, there's a participant here who's made a comment that made me reflect. Giovanna Folcini said, this is not just sharing information, right, coaching? It's also about understanding how the person interacts with the environment with this information and the sense they make about this information themselves. So there's much more just to say, okay, this is kind of what your profile would suggest, or the kind of roles you'd be suitable for. But how does the person think and feel about this information? It's what I think is still quite unique, to the coaching relationship, the sense making. There's no understanding of how I react to this information. Some participants are asking for useful prompts that we can share to practice ChatGPT kind of interactions. I'm sure there's some in the presentation, but you can really ask anything that's very specific to a job description, for instance. I sometimes copy and paste, for fun, a set of criteria framework, and that will help kind of the ChatGPT or the AI do its work. But beware, there are still loads of mistakes, which leads to one of the questions, can I just forget about becoming Hogan trained one day and just use I would say, well, we don't know, but there are still lots and lots of mistakes, and you need the expertise to be able to discriminate between those.
Yeah, and that's absolutely the case, right? So, if AI made a mistake, if you weren't trained, you wouldn't know. You would just go, "Oh, it sounds good to me," right? And we've all seen those cases, right? I'll admit I've used AI to put in medical symptoms that people I've known have had to see what the AI will say. And I'm not a medical doctor, but I'll read it and go, sounds pretty good to me. Maybe it could be that, but a medical doctor might be able to quickly go, you know what, it's not that. That doesn't make any sense, and here's why. So, yeah, I think ultimately, we're not looking at replacing medical doctors either. I think we're still going to need that expertise to, while these things can accelerate recommendations, they might, again, in the case of a medical doctor, they might go, "Ooh, I hadn't considered that. Now that you mention it, maybe that does fit the case," right? So that's where I think these things can be really useful. But ultimately, you're going to need that human to double check it. You're going to need that human to say, yeah, this does make sense. As for prompts, yes, Andrea, there are some in the presentation here that can be used, but I would say it's useful to just go test some out yourself to give it a try. You can ask questions around creating development plans for individuals. That's one of my favorite ways to use it. Say somebody just got hired and they're onboarded, you have their job description. You could put in things like their Hogan profile. And by the way, some of these old ones I actually had to type in the scores. Just so you know, today you can actually put in Hogan reports and it will extract those scores and help provide, information around that. So again, if you were working with somebody, you want to create a development plan. That's where I think it can be really valuable. Like if I have a blank piece of paper and need to create a development plan for someone, that's going to take me a lot of work. But if I can ask an AI tool to generate me a development plan, a 6-month development plan for someone in a particular role, and we want it to be individualized. So that's why we want that personality data in there as well. An AI tool can generate you a pretty good development plan very quickly. Now, is it the perfect development plan? Is it the one that makes the most sense for that organization? I don't know. But you do. You're the expert. You're working with that organization. You can look at the outline that ChatGPT gives you and go, these are some good ideas, but I'm going to remove this one. I'm going to change the order on this one. That's the way I really see this as sort of helping us generate more ideas that we could use or discard. Again, thinking about it like an assistant or a colleague that you're working with.
Sure. Thank you. And we also had a question clarifying, what we talk about when we talk about coaching, because somebody said we are consultants, not coaches. So these actually refers, to your executive coaching profession. So if you are indeed an executive coach, that kind of was the framework for using ChatGPT to again, guide and maybe support and maybe challenge your interpretation, see if you missed anything out of it. So that was the context.
Yeah, that's right.
The,
I think that works in both cases, Andrea, where consultants would be in the same position. Again, they may be using it for slightly different things instead of delivering coaching advice, but it might be advice to the client that they're working with. Say, okay, this is what you're going to get with this candidate. This is what you're going to get with this candidate, and helping them make some critical decisions.
And there's lots of questions around, the future, right? So super intelligence apparently is around the corner. There's lots of talk about this. There will be ChatGPT 6, 7, 8, and so forth. So would the trends change? Do you think much will change between the, I suppose, human and machine interaction in doing
Yeah.
consulting work?
Ultimately, I don't know the answer to this question, right? So we are seeing improvements with each version of these LLMs that come out. Particularly, a lot of the improvements have been focused on logical reasoning kinds of tasks more recently, because that's been an area where they've really struggled. You've probably seen the how many R's are in the word strawberry, and ChatGPT continues to struggle to tell you how many R's there are in that word. So there have been some improvements really around that, sort of walking it through step by step, breaking down the process to try to get to better answers. I don't think we've seen dramatic improvement in the text-based response since maybe 5.0 has sort of been even that wasn't much better than 4.1 or 4.0. So, do I think it's going to replace reports? I don't think so. Our reports are grounded in reputation data. They're grounded in 360 data. ChatGPT or these kind of tools can reflect that to some extent, but I don't think they can fully replace it. And particularly, the biggest thing I would worry about is the vetting of those reports. Right? How can we quality control or quality assure the accuracy of those reports if it's generated by AI? If I got 1 out of 100 wrong, I would feel really bad for that one person. I tell my staff all the time, in the work that we do, the line of work that we do is real consequences for real people. We just can't make mistakes. Like we can't make scoring errors. We can't make interpretation errors because there's so much on the line for people. And that's what I worry about with replacing these tools completely with something like an AI. It seems really tempting, but I worry that, geez, if you're 1 in 1,000 is wrong, yeah, that's just an error rate that to me is unacceptable. I think AI can help round out information you're seeing in reports, but I don't see it as replacing reports.
And on this note, is Hogan planning to introduce some sort of AI assistant feature to navigate maybe the data that's already generated in the report? So actually, rather than tapping into ChatGPT, you will have your own model, right, built, I suppose, on Hogan's understanding of reputational description and so forth.
Yeah, so we have built some tools and we've been testing those for almost a year now that do leverage AI. We don't know if this will be the name long term, but we refer to it as the Hogan AI Assistant. And that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to assist coaches and consultants or any kind of practitioner who's using our assessments. It's designed to take into account job information. A version we're working on right now is also designed to bring in 360 information as well. That can be really powerful for quickly identifying an individual's key strengths and weaknesses. That's one of my favorite parts about it, is that if you can quickly boil someone's profile in a job context down to their key strengths and weaknesses, this is how this person is going to show up on the job. And you could hand that to someone who has no background in Hogan. You could say, hey, here's how this person is going to show up. You could hand it to your CEO or your hiring managers that you're working with in your company and say, this is what they're going to look like. That could be a real game changer for how people make decisions and improving those kind of decisions. So yeah, we are developing some AI tools around this. I don't want to make any promises on when they're going to be, ready for the public use, but they are very impressive, and we're continuing to test and build out additional features on the one we have internally.
Thank you, Ryan. And there's I suppose, the final comment that leads to some of the questions and I suppose concerns that people have expressed in the chat as well in the Q&A is whether AI would ever be a better human communicator than us. So there's a lot of course, interactions, and there is emotional intelligence, there is communication skills, even in any interaction. We don't know whether they will be able to develop the level of empathy and read silences. Here we go, right, understanding relevance. But I suppose, in the past, there's always been this thread of consultants or coaches being replaced by machines, but it's never fully happened. Even LMS systems, have not really replaced human exchanges and I suppose training practices, right? So there seems to be a thread that's impossible to eradicate, maybe thankfully, which is the human interaction, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, on a text level, we're seeing AI, around about the level of pretty good, not necessarily top expert, but pretty good coaches. But these tools are continuing to be developed. People are developing AI tools around reading nonverbal signals. They're developing AI tools around picking up on pace of speech, pauses, hesitations. Those aren't as picked up as well by text. Most of these tools just grab the text and it can do the feedback, can do a session with text. In fact, we've tested of one that you can actually go through a whole feedback session with verbally. You can actually ask questions and it will answer questions and it will say, oh, are you ready to move on? You say yes. And it'll say, okay, now let's talk about your score on inquisitiveness. And it will tell you what inquisitive is. And it'll have a whole conversation with you. They're amazing because they can change languages. So if you want to speak in Spanish or Italian or Hindi or whatever you want to do, it can instantly change language and do all that kind of thing for you. So they're really impressive in that way. I will give one edge possibly to the AI coach for the individual. And that is that there may be things that even with a coach you are unwilling to share. but you might be comfortable sharing it with someone who's not a real person. You might say, this isn't a real person.
Mhm.
They don't exist. They're not going to judge me. They are they're available 24/7, right? So in the middle of the night I can wake up and ask them. So those are some things that I think the AI coach has in its advantage, but I still think ultimately we see more value with our well-trained and well-experienced coaches.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as everything, in this field, everything may change next month when something new
Yeah, for
and
sure.
amazing is introduced. But thank you for that. Very insightful. Thank you everyone for joining us. Now we're a couple of minutes over. We haven't been able to maybe answer all the questions, but if there's anything unanswered, we'll do that after the presentation. We'll send you the recording, the slides. Yeah, so thanks again for coming, and we'll keep the conversation going.
Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you, and bye, everyone. Thank you.